Not just the Russian military, but even Russian banks are now being drawn into the fight against Ukrainian drone attacks. Russia turns key financial hubs into fortified zones as Kiev expands its long-range drone campaign deeper into Russian territory. Vladimir Putin signs a new law allowing banking institutions to respond directly to drone threats. Russian banks are reportedly cleared to deploy jammers, air defense tools, and armed security units against aerial attacks. Fresh debate erupts after Kiev accuses Moscow of targeting civilians, while Russian civilian infrastructure increasingly comes under attack. Russia has passed a new law allowing its central bank and select firms to counter drone threats amid rising Ukrainian strikes inside Russia. The law allows the central bank, Sberbank and cash collection associations to deploy anti-drone systems around key facilities. As per a report by Financial Times, authorized staff will also be allowed to carry weapons to protect financial infrastructure. Russian lawmaker Anatoly Aksakov said the new security measures would not be funded by the state budget. Aksakov said Sberbank was included in the law due to its special mission in occupied Ukrainian territories. The move highlights growing concern in Moscow over Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities inside Russia. Russian officials said jamming systems and other drone defense equipment would be deployed around sensitive sites. The development comes as Ukraine continues targeting military, energy and strategic facilities inside Russian territory. A central bank branch in Crimea also came under attack during an overnight strike reported on May 27. Moscow-appointed officials claimed the attack involved multiple weapons, including Storm Shadow missiles. The Financial Times report said the Kremlin move has also exposed continuing gaps in Russia's domestic security systems. Russian companies have already been spending their own money on anti-drone protection, according to the report. A Russian businessman told the Financial Times that Moscow provided nothing for corporate drone defense needs. Business groups have also urged the Kremlin to help cover the rising cost of drone protection systems. Russian firms have reported difficulties in buying equipment and finding trained operators for such systems. A top Putin aide threatened European leaders after they ignored Russia's latest warning surrounding escalating tensions linked to Kiev recently. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev mocked European governments publicly during a sharply worded post shared online through social media. Medvedev criticized the European Union for continuing diplomatic operations inside Ukraine's capital despite mounting Russian military threats recently nationwide. The remarks followed Moscow's warning urging foreigners to leave Kiev before possible systematic strikes targeting the Ukrainian capital unfold. Dmitry Medvedev said, and I quote, "The EU has said it will maintain its diplomatic presence in Kiev unchanged, despite Russia's warnings. Well, apparently they've got diplomats to spare and need to trim the headcount." Unquote. Russia increased pressure on Europe by signaling possible escalation connected to continuing attacks and rising tensions surrounding the ongoing conflict. Despite Moscow's warnings, the European Union announced it would maintain diplomatic missions and personnel inside Kiev without any reductions. Anua Elenouni said, and I quote, "We will not change our position or presence in Kiev. Russian attacks, unfortunately, are daily reality both in Kiev and in other parts of Ukraine. Russia is once again trying to cynically shift the blame for its own aggression, Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine, onto Ukraine." Unquote. Russia earlier accused European leaders of allowing Ukraine complete freedom despite escalating attacks and growing regional instability recently nationwide. European officials dismissed Moscow's warnings as intimidation tactics designed primarily to spread fear and pressure Western governments politically afterward. The escalating rhetoric fueled fears that Russia could intensify military strikes against Kiev during the already volatile conflict phase anytime. Medvedev's latest remarks further deepened international concerns surrounding possible Russian escalation and broader confrontation involving European nations directly. Moscow said the EU's silence has encouraged fresh Ukrainian strikes on civilian targets. A Russian foreign ministry official made the remarks in comments carried by the Izvestia newspaper, according to TASS. Rodion Miroshnik said Europe was deliberately ignoring what Moscow described as Ukraine's violations of international and humanitarian law. Rodion Miroshnik said, and I quote, "This, war crimes, is one of the important issues that will undoubtedly arise on the negotiation track. The question here is whether international humanitarian law in the form of the Geneva Conventions, additional protocols, and a whole list of conventions should be swept under the rug, or whether international humanitarian law is binding on everyone. If it is binding on everyone, then Europe will have to admit that Kiev committed such crimes." Unquote. EU leaders condemned Russia's latest strikes but did not mention the reported attack on the dormitory in Sberbank. Russian authorities said 21 people were killed and another 60 were injured in Sberbank. Moscow said most of those killed in the dormitory strike were teenage girls. Russian officials said Ukrainian drones hit the main college building and dormitory in 3 waves. Russia later launched what it described as a massive retaliatory strike on Ukraine. Moscow said the attack involved Oreshnik, Iskander, Kinshal, and Zircon missile systems. The Russian Defense Ministry said command posts, air bases, and defense plants were hit. Ursula von der Leyen accused Moscow of brutality and of showing disregard for human life. Koja Corliss described Russia's actions as a political scare tactic after the strikes. Macron vowed to increase support for Ukraine, while Merz called the escalation reckless. Reports said none of those European leaders referred to the deadly Sberbank dormitory attack. Maria Zakharova said the BBC and CNN had rejected Moscow's invitation to visit the site. Russia dramatically escalated the war by announcing systematic retaliatory strikes targeting military and command infrastructure across Kiev immediately. Moscow warned foreigners and diplomats to leave Kiev before launching what it called systematic retaliatory military operations nationwide. Russia said the strikes were retaliation for last week's Ukrainian drone attack inside Russian-controlled territory near Sberbank recently. Moscow accused Ukraine of targeting a college dormitory in Sberbank during the deadly drone strike on May 22. Russian officials claimed the attack killed 21 people, injured over 60 others, and deliberately targeted children inside the facility. Ukraine denied intentionally attacking civilians, insisting its forces targeted drone coordination and military-linked operational infrastructure instead across territories. Moscow called the incident further proof of what it described as Kiev's terrorist and Nazi nature during escalating tensions. Russian officials warned Kiev's command centers, military headquarters, and decision-making facilities would become direct operational targets immediately nationwide. Russia also urged foreign citizens, diplomats, and international organizations to evacuate Kiev immediately before further escalation unfolds across Ukraine. Residents throughout Kiev were advised to avoid government, military, and administrative locations vulnerable to possible Russian strikes immediately nationwide. The warning followed one of Russia's heaviest coordinated missile and drone assaults since the Ukraine war originally began years ago. Russian forces reportedly used drones, cruise missiles, and Oreshnik hypersonic missiles during recent large-scale coordinated attacks across Ukraine. Ukrainian officials reported extensive destruction across Kiev, including severe damage to homes, schools, and major civilian infrastructure facilities nationwide. President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Moscow of deliberately terrorizing civilians through relentless bombardments targeting cities and infrastructure across Ukraine.